Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for February 23rd, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by John and Hogoboom. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
It's good to see you here again.
Yes.
You got the privilege of hosting last week.
I did.
And Matt Kaiser, welcome, Matt.
How's it going,
Good
Brian?
to see you here again as well. And it's good to be back. Myself, I'm Brian Rexroad, and we'll jump right into it. And well, I guess the big bug, this could be the big bug of the year, right?
Well,
or maybe not. So, John, if you'd like to...
We'll have some discussion on how big we think this is. So, bug was discovered in glibc.
Right.
So, glibc is kind of, it's the library that has some functionality for looking up domain names to IP addresses and vice versa, like the get ADDR info call, which is a specific call in glibc that they're referencing a bug in. Some researchers at Google discovered they were doing some stuff with SSH, and they discovered that they were getting a segmentation fault, and they're like, well, that's not good. That means there must be something, possibly exploitable here. And after they ferreted it all the way through, they discovered it was in glibc, and they wrote a proof of concept. And I'm not going to say I'm an expert on this vulnerability. I did look at their proof of concept code, but it is a buffer overflow. It looks like it's in the DNS response that comes back, and they have kind of a client server, two sets of scripts, one to test this out, so you can actually exploit it, or at least prove out that this works. They also discovered that independently, the glibc authors have been looking at this since July, and the guys at Red Hat have been looking at this bug as well. I guess it's in their system. They're looking to try and figure out how to fix it. It's also been around, the bug, since 2008. It's just that nobody was really kind of aware that this is a path of vulnerability. What could happen potentially here is if you are able to exploit this, let's say I'm a client machine, Linux, it's going to be a Linux type environment, or Unix, because I don't think Windows would be impacted by this glibc vulnerability. And I use glibc in some program to do this DNS resolution. So maybe like an SSH client or a web server client where it needs to look up that domain name and resolve it to an IP address that it can contact it. Those are possible avenues of exploitation there.
Right.
The trick here, in my opinion, is that it is a DNS type of vulnerability where I'm trying to do a buffer overflow with a DNS response. And most people are going to be somewhat insulated through a chain of cache resolvers or other bind resolvers before they, get to the actual authoritative server that's going to try to push a weaponized response to me, or whatever. I don't know if weaponized is the right term there, but a buffer overflow response to me. And that would have to come from the authoritative server for that domain name, unless a caching resolver could carry it through to you, which I don't know that anybody's proved that that's possible yet.
Right.
Upside is, I think, for the most part, the infrastructure of the internet will probably insulate most people from this vector of attack. That's not to say you couldn't in very controlled circumstances. If I'm in like a Wi-Fi hotspot cafe or something, and I can start, pretending I'm the DNS server for everything or something to all the people there, I could probably potentially exploit it.
Right.
But how many people are roaming around with Linux in a Wi-Fi hotspot? Anyway, go ahead.
The proof of concept code that they posted, it looks like they provided both the client and the server.
Right.
And I'm used to seeing proof of concept code that works against a particular piece of software, and so it's a vulnerable server, and I provide the attacking client, or vice versa. Having both sides kind of makes it a toy problem. I'd like to see someone come up with real proof of concept code against existing software, because people were saying this thing affects Bitcoin, this thing affects SSH, there's all sorts of, at this point I haven't seen anything concrete.
No offense, Matt, but I'd like to see it get patched.
I'd like that too.
But to your point, I agree. This is a case where not only do you need to be able to exploit the vulnerability, and the circumstances around actually being able to exploit it are not fully understood at this point, right? And the other aspect is that you'd have to gain control of the server in some respect, either through an authoritative record, which might get filtered out by caching resolvers, or to actually gain control of the caching resolver, or to do something like DNS changer, where you're pointing somebody to a rogue DNS server. And I think what you were alluding to, John, is if in a local an untrusted LAN environment, somebody could beat the race to answer a DNS response with a a falsified response or something along those lines, which wouldn't be all that easy, but could be done.
Right.
So there are circumstances where perhaps you could behave like a rogue server in combination with performing the exploit. But I guess I would kind of, if you can be a rogue DNS resolver, you can also point somebody to a whole plethora of other sorts of exploits and drive-by type things. So the question becomes, is this the most lucrative, the most effective, the most efficient avenue for somebody to actually do the exploit? Will they bother putting together an exploit if you still have to control the DNS infrastructure to do it? So we'd like to get it patched. It's hopefully it'll get taken care of very soon. Is there a patch available yet, or are they still working on it?
That's a good question. I can't remember if there is or not.
Yeah, I haven't seen information about patches at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that they were all, once they discovered it, the Google researchers, the Red Hat guys, and the glibc guys were all kind of, sharing notes so they could, work a solution to this effectively. So I think you're probably right that there is a patch available at this point.
Yeah. All right. So going forward, hopefully the patches will get deployed quickly. It's obviously going to take a while if everybody's got to patch all their Linux platforms to be able to correct this. So be on the lookout for things that might concern you there. The next story I thought I'd bring up here is actually related to something that was pretty broadly in the news. It was related to ransomware. There was a particular hospital out in California, and the particular hospital is not important here, but they paid a ransom. They, I think originally the news came out it was going to be like $3.5 million in ransom or something like that. I don't know where that
ridiculous.
Yeah,
number.
I don't know where that number came from. In this particular case, they actually paid apparently $17,000 in ransom. They apparently did this before contacting law enforcement for any assistance, but did apparently subsequently contact law enforcement about this issue. I guess my personal opinion, I think most of us pretty much agree. Avoid paying the ransom at all costs. You really are playing roulette in a sense. It really feeds this industry if you do pay the ransom, but on top of that, it may not even help you to recover your data. It's much, much better to protect yourself ahead of time. And that includes, keeping your running antivirus, keeping it current. Use network controls, intrusion protection systems, port restrictions, that is, don't allow outbound connections on your network that aren't necessary, proxy web connections, and use the categorization associated with most proxy services to be able to block access to unrecognized sites or categorize malicious sites. Basically monitor for malicious callback, that is anything that might be associated with an infection that may have been able to establish a footprint inside your enterprise. Look for the indications that it might be trying to call back. And back up your data. Special note for backing up data, that is if you end up in a situation where you have ransomware, you're able to restore that data. Most backup solutions today do not really account for ransomware. That is the notion of, encrypting your data. What will tend to happen is if the file name stays the same, it'll encrypt that, it'll back up your your encrypted form of the file.
This is the new version of your hard
this is the new.
We'll just save that.
Right.
Yeah, exactly right.
Oh, wow.
So, and this is something that what I would actually encourage is if you have a vendor that you're working with for backup, talk with them. Tell them that this is your concern and that you're going to be looking for vendors that support protection from malicious, data integrity corruption. So anyway. And if you do get detected, if you do detect a case, disconnect from the network and clean or re-image the system before reconnecting. That is, in some cases at least, the decryption cannot continue if it isn't able to get keys to be able to do that encryption. So if it loses its callback capability, it could at least disrupt the process of doing that encryption. Determine the source of the malware so that you can basically control that, whether it came in through an email perhaps, or perhaps was spread through an infected USB drive. And of course, be careful about USB drives. Some of these spread through USB drives, right? And then last but not least, be cautious of your backup data. That is, the backup data itself could actually have infected files associated with it. So you're going to want to be careful about doing your restore and make sure that you're only restoring files that you absolutely need. So Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was thinking of the things you're talking about here, besides antivirus and backing up your data, they seem to be enterprise solutions. Whenever I think of ransomware, I think of, somebody's grandmother clicking on the wrong link and ending up with it. So what would we say for folks that don't have access to or wouldn't understand how to set up an IDS on their home network or look for outbound connections?
Well, I think that's a situation where you're going to be relying on your antivirus and your data backup. And keeping an offline backup, even if it's a month old, for most residential folks, is probably not going to be that big a deal. In fact, it's probably a little better to have longer periods between your backup intervals to protect against a ransomware type thing, because I'm not aware of any particular cases where they'll sit dormant for a long time and then, before posting the ransom message. But did you have any other?
No, I think you got all the ones I was going to bring up.
Well, the one thing I was going to say is having a
be
backup.
careful what you click on.
What's that?
Try to not to get infected in the first place.
Right. Well, of course. From an enterprise perspective, having a good backup strategy is important, but I think it's also important to have, maybe some kind of yearly or quarterly, if you can do it, exercise to say, well, let's simulate an event here where we have to recover 100 machines that have ransomware on it because they're totally trashed at this point, just so that your incident response teams will kind of have a process and be able to get everybody back into business as quickly as possible. Because if you don't test the process, you might find out that, hey, our data is no good. We thought we were backing up all this time, but we really haven't been.
Yeah, even without malicious intent, there are a lot of situations where folks believe they're backing up data, and then when they go trying to restore it, find that the restoration process doesn't work properly.
Right.
And so you're absolutely right. Any process that you haven't tested is not one that you can rely upon when you really need it.
Right.
So anyway, don't pay the ransom. That's the the basic story here. Now, we talk a lot about IoT, Matt, and I think this falls into the category of a couple of IoT fails.
I've never heard of any kind of IoT fails.
Well,
Brian.
I think this.
Do explain.
There are a lot of fails things on the internet, but I think some mistakes are being made. Perhaps these devices just really need a little. I'm saying perhaps. That's a really suggestion.
They absolutely do.
A lot of the device manufacturers really need to get a handle on the security thing. So tell us about these couple of examples.
Sure. So we have two for this week. Pentest Partners has a really interesting write-up about a DVR box they picked up very cheap. They just wanted to say, let's see how bad these things really are. And I like the way that it was written up, and I was talking to you earlier, John, about the way it's like they're saying, well, we wondered if maybe we could get the password. It turns out they're using admin and blank for the password. Not the word blank, a blank.
No password.
No password.
I don't even think that showed up in the top 100 passwords or whatever.
I don't know if we record that as an option, like a no password.
No password.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it showed up in the top, so maybe that's a really good password.
No one's looking for it.
Strangely not complex.
Nobody thinks anybody's that dumb. No password whatsoever.
Okay.
But then it's like, then they found a web auth bypass, and they're like, well, that's nice, but maybe I want a shell on the box. And they found a web shell, and they're like, well, maybe I want some sort of remote shell instead. And they found that, and they found things like unauthenticated telnet, and there's a whole list in the article. The really interesting thing that they found is that apparently the box will send screenshots of the first camera that's attached, because these are controllers for multiple cameras. It'll send screenshots to this email address, lawishhere@yeah.net. With no explanation, never tells the user this is going to happen. It just starts sending screenshots. So whether this is some sort of debug code that was never taken out, or this is some sort of insidious code that's there to spy on users of the DVRs, it's not really clear. Somebody found like a code repo that belonged to this person and said, so what are you doing here? And it was then taken offline quietly. So more questions than answers on this one at this point. But maybe it's not always true that these are just bugs that someone careless put in. It's possible someone's putting things in that are not in the owner's best interest. So that was an interesting read. The other one that I saw this week, Risk-Based Security put out a document on these DVRs from a company called RaySharp. And apparently RaySharp DVRs all use the same password, and it's hard-coded, and the user is root, and the password is 519070. And you can't change that. And there's some interesting read in their paper where they link to, and they say, well, here's an Amazon post from like 2012, some guy complaining about it, and he heard back from their corporate, and they said, well, if you ever lose your password, just change your password by using this password. I'll let you think about that. And then apparently there was an even earlier one in 2010 on some other closed circuit TV forum where someone else had found the same bug. And apparently this has been around for a long time. Risk-based security had found in Shodan at least 36,000, somewhere up until about 45,000 of these devices are exposed directly to the internet with a web interface. So it's kind of a problem.
Yeah.
And I feel like now that this is out, this is probably going to be added to the list of popular usernames and passwords for exploiting boxes for IoT botnets.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is a shame, and I have to admit, while you were saying that, I was getting a little bit of heartburn, and so that's settled a little bit now. But nevertheless, I'm not even sure what to say. I mean, these are a couple of, I think,
there's so many different devices like this that we come across all the time that have these backdoors put in them. And they're these consumer type, embedded devices. I don't understand who's putting these things together and like what kind of source code control like these companies have before they decide, yeah, this is good, let's deploy this on all of our devices and send it to our customers.
I'm with you. I've been scratching my head on this. I used to have a full head of hair. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, John, so I guess this is just actually another, but this is a little bit of a different situation. It's not IoT, it's actually security software.
Right.
Another example.
Yeah, another example of what were they thinking here.
And before we go on here, forgive me for digressing here, but for these IoT things, I mean, quite frankly, I don't really know of a way to protect yourself against these types of things other than that when you go shopping for a device, dig around a little bit. Look for terms like backdoor vulnerabilities for these brands of devices and try to find ones that, don't have a lot out there.
Stick a firewall in front of them.
No. Here's the idea for the app. This is our new mobile app, and people are watching. If someone implements this, just let me know and just give me a credit. And take the box, scan the barcode, look it up in a database, take the device number, look it up in, I don't know, US search database or the MITRE CVE list, and just give me a list of the things that I need to worry about, and then if it's been patched or not. And if I can patch it, I can do that. But if most,
the My Credible Device app.
I think we can find something catchier. I'll work with marketing on that one.
Okay. I'll give you. All right. So
I expect a prototype by next week.
Oh, jeez.
All right, John. Back to you. So this is the security software thing.
Right. So Comodo, who is an antivirus security vendor, they have some software that can run on your endpoint Windows machine. They actually, in their Comodo Internet Security Suite, they have a module called Geek Buddy that runs. And what that actually is, and I haven't actually heard a good explanation of why they have this functionality in there, but it's actually a VNC server. And if you're not familiar with VNC, it's a lot like Remote Desktop Protocol. It allows someone to connect to a port on your computer and then see your desktop and interact with it if they needed to.
Now, would this be using port 5900? Do we know if it's
I don't know if we know exactly which port it was running on, but it was definitely running on the machine, and it was configured without a password. So if you did have a VNC client software and you knew what port to connect to, you just, boom, you'd be right into the machine. And if that machine was connected to the internet, it would potentially be exposed to all of the internet to find it as well. But I'm not quite sure on the port if it was the normal 5900 or not.
Okay.
The other interesting aspect of it is, even though you're running, like the Comodo software tries to sandbox a lot of applications, not the VNC server part, but sandbox your internet browser or other things that are running to help protect your system from getting infected. But if some code was running on your browser inside a sandbox, it's not stopping it from connecting back into the VNC server and now having full control of your machine, if it was smart enough to know how to do that.
It was there.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's really it's an interesting vulnerability. Why it's there, I'm not quite sure, as part of their suite.
So your point being that even if you're inside a protected network and the inbound port to the VNC server is blocked, if you browse to a site that's under their control, this browser scripting could loop back. Is that what?
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So you could have like, they have a VNC
so
client
that'll
run
enterprise
in your
protection.
Yes, it can still connect to ports on wherever. So it could connect to like the local host on that, the VNC port and connect to it and interact with it if it needed to, and then push that back out to somebody else. So interesting bug. Comodo responded by adding a password to it. However, the password that they used was computed from a couple of elements on the machine, like the hard disk properties and the serial number of the machine or something. Something that could be, an attacker could probably get access to as well and say, oh, I can figure out what the password is, and they'd be able to get in as well. And then since then, Comodo has released another update that says they addressed the vulnerability, but they don't specify how it was actually addressed. So just an interesting, why? I don't understand, what. First of all, why is that there? I'm thinking in my head from a security vulnerability. Why would I need a VNC server as part of my security suite?
So with a name like GeekBuddy, to me, that sounds like some sort of support. If some versions of Windows have the ability, if you want to have somebody remote control your computer, if you need help with it, someone else will pop in and take a look at what's going on. It might be designed for that.
Could be.
With a name like GeekBuddy.
Yeah.
But, hey, how about putting
That was kind of my
put a
guess.
password on it?
Yeah.
Let the user decide
There's
what the
right ways
password
to do
should be.
that. Yeah.
I think this is one of these situations where generally the folks that are going to need support aren't going to really be in a position to do good security practices, and so it really is a balance. I'm trying to just play devil's advocate here, or defend them in some respect. Is that there is a difficult balance between ease of use or being able to support customers and really doing security right, and we're always kind of walking that balance. I think collectively as a community, kind of walking that balance, and to really do it right takes a lot of cost, a lot of investment, a lot of tricks and tools, and it can break more easily, and there may be other kinds of bugs that get introduced into it. So I think it's always a balance here. Now, personally, I tend to agree that having no password is really not an excusable type situation, but
You know what they could do?
there's no perfect.
I'm just thinking about this. There are certain systems that if you want to, it's like pairing your phone to I'll use the Chromecast for example. It'll show you something up on the screen. You got to type that in, and between the two of them, they figure it out. If you're on the phone with somebody and they say, well, can you connect to my computer and tell me what's going on? If you read the password over the phone to the client, there's a way to do that. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, there are ways that this could be done, and it's a matter without too much pain, right? And again, it becomes a balance between those. In fact, my suspicion is that's the reason some of these backdoors are in place is that the mindset of the developers was nobody's going to ever figure this out, and if we have to go in and fix something because there's some catastrophic problem, turns out the back door is the catastrophic problem, but if we have to go in and fix these, we'll have a way to be able to do it, and it turns out to kind of backfire in itself in time, and it's just a matter of time. So nevertheless, I've been searching for, like I said, I started this job with a full head of hair.
Yeah.
All right, Matt, so let's go to you, and I guess here we have, this sounds like it's more of an accident, where,
Well, depends on whose side you're on. This may have been an accident in somebody on the defensive side, but it's certainly not an accident in what happened next.
Right.
So what happened here
absolutely.
is the Linux Mint, which is a variant of Ubuntu, which is a variant of Debian. All these are different related distros, but Linux Mint is actually one that I had been using. Apparently, over the weekend, their blog got hacked, and they're running WordPress, and WordPress does have a bit of a reputation for having some
it's hard to keep it up to date.
It's a little bit of work. If you're not updating it yourself, it's a little bit of work. If you are updating itself, some places will do it automatically for you, but it seems there was some flaw. It's not really clear at this point what the flaw was, but it allowed the attackers to make modifications to the web page, and they pointed the download link to Linux Mint 17.3 Cinnamon version to an FTP server in Bulgaria, which also served.
That's fine.
Oh, it's fine because it also served up the download ISO, except it wasn't the real download ISO. It was modified to automatically run a DDoS bot known as Tsunami or Kaiten. So the interesting thing here is that it's a pretty impressive hack, to get people who are downloading it to download this software and be none the wiser, unless, and some people still do this, they were comparing the MD5 hash that was provided on the site and saying, wait a second, this isn't the right file. But some people don't do that. Well, most people don't do that. Some people are very particular about that sort of thing. So they managed they thought they'd fix that, and then the site got popped again. So it popped twice, They took down linuxmint.com. I'm not sure if it's up right now, but it was at least taken down for a time period to figure out what happened. And the database for the website for the PHPBB forum was sold on the darknet for $80 in Bitcoin.
$80 in Bitcoin.
$80.
Yeah.
So to me, you've got a combination of an $80 sale of what's probably some pretty good information, and a DDoS bot being put in. Of all the things you could have done if you were going to compromise an operating system, you put in a DDoS bot that uses IRC for command and control, like 2001 style malware. I mean,
it still works.
People were basically saying they could have done a whole lot worse with this, and for whatever reason they chose not to,
or didn't know how to do it.
Or didn't know how to do it. It really.
So and I think there's perhaps something to that. That somebody that perhaps is capable of, and this doesn't. You don't have to necessarily be an expert here, but somebody that has grasped the process of exploiting a vulnerability in WordPress and manipulating the site and putting it and then modifying the distribution isn't necessarily somebody that's an expert in command and control associated with a botnet. So they're really taking a number of different pieces and parts here, putting them together with enough technical competence. If it were an organized group with a lot of experts in different areas, it would perhaps be a different story, and that's perhaps a good idea, good thing. And
I keep thinking of when WordPress blogs get attacked. It's usually someone who's posting in the banner, hacked by team name here, here's the flag, here's all of our members, greets to these guys, disses to these guys, sort of stuff.
Right.
So.
Okay, well, hopefully they can get that
drive-by exploits.
Or they do that, or redirects for other drive-by exploits.
Yeah, hopefully they get that straightened out pretty quickly and get those distributions. Now, I guess the question becomes how many folks have downloaded that, and
it's a good question.
Is there a way to let them know or get it updated?
Well, the assumption, I guess, is if you download the ISO within that time frame, and it was only about 1 day, chances are it's no good. And they have given you, they basically, I don't know if they've contacted people, but they've made it very clear on the site, by the way, this is a time period in which if you downloaded it, you should just delete it and get the new version.
All right. Well, if you got it last weekend, delete it and get the new version. Okay, so looking at the internet weather for the last week or so here, first of all, what we show up in our analysis is scan probes on port 1234 TCP. It actually turns out when we look at this a little more closely, you can see the activity on the graph. It's pretty obvious there. This is apparently backscatter from a denial of service attack, or perhaps a series of denial of service attacks that are taking place. I looked at it in a number of different points, and it looked like the target was pretty consistent. There were a couple of places where there were other targets involved here, but they looked like they may have even been related targets. But in this particular case, or at least one of the points, the target was a cloud service provider in France, or probably one of their clients in that cloud service provider. This is based on flow data here, so the source ports were consistently 80 TCP, and they were consistently SYN-ACK flags. So we're basically seeing the backscatter from denial of service attack activity here, and that apparently is continuing. With widely spoofed source IPs. Good point, John. So, and that's why it basically the backscatter, sprays widely across the internet, and you may see that, in fact, and be able to recognize it. Next one is scan probes on port 5353 UDP, and this is basically a port that's assigned to multicast DNS. And I'm not really in a good position to describe exactly how multicast DNS works here, but we're looking at the last 90 days of activity. I wanted to give it a sort of a bigger swath so you could see how this is trending. This protocol is apparently used, or it's available in Apple OS X, as well as on Linux. Theoretically, this protocol could be used kind of similar to like a regular DNS for amplification, so in a reflective denial of service attack. So we're seeing clearly reconnaissance activity, looking for responders to this particular protocol, and you can see that activity is increasing, which is generally an indicator that the sort of the test probes that the folks that are doing this reconnaissance have found that it's producing some results, and so they're ramping up their activity to find more. So my guess is that they are finding responders on this port. But we are not seeing up at this point any significant response activity associated with this, at least not in this port. So it doesn't look like it's being actively used in reflective denial of service attacks, but this would be something to perhaps keep a lookout for to see if this develops into yet another of the reflective denial of service attack vectors. There are other potentials here, that is to be able to find DNS servers. You can potentially manipulate them in other ways, so that would be perhaps another motivation for this reconnaissance. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, well, there really aren't too many surprises here. In fact, I don't see any surprises. Top of the list, port 23 TCP. That's basically a lot of devices scanning for telnet and doing password guessing activities, followed by 53413. That's a netis router backdoor, where you can basically just send a packet with script information in it, and it will try to execute those. Followed by 1900 UDP. This appears to be reconnaissance associated with looking for SSDP servers. A lot of that activity is blocked now. And then followed by port 22 TCP, 443 TCP, 1911, which is basically researching, and that was associated, and I keep forgetting, remind me again, this was a building automation tool.
Tritium, Fox, I always forget the manufacturer. Niagara.
Niagara, there we go. Followed by port 445 TCP, 80 TCP, 21 TCP. That again is, I think, predominantly research activity. That is, what I would describe as reputable research organizations that are looking for systems that are vulnerable. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that information gets made public, and so it could be used by nefarious actors equally, as well as legitimate researchers or organizations trying to protect themselves. Looking at the trend here in terms of scan probes on port 23 TCP, you can see that in the last week or so we're again in an upward trend in terms of the number of probes, but certainly not up at the peak that we've seen. Now, just to put this into perspective, we're looking at hundreds of millions of probes per hour here, so there's a huge amount of probing activity on just port 23 that is taking place. Looking at scan probes on port 53413 in the trend here, well, it's relatively flat. We haven't seen much change in terms of the number of probes. Now, you'll see here there's a little bit of a dip that occurred, it looks like around the 18th of February, and I think we're going to see a corresponding dip in the number of sources that are doing the probing when we look at that chart a little bit later on here. So looking at the most sources doing the probing, at the top of the list, port 23 again, and then followed by 53413. Now, if we were to just take a look at the combination of those two, port 23, 53413, and I'm kind of making which is perhaps a false assumption, that the addresses that are doing that probing are unique between those two. They may not be entirely unique, but look at that pie chart. It's actually taking up around 60% of that pie chart. Both of those are attributable basically to almost entirely to security surveillance camera DVRs or home routers and that type of thing.
About
perhaps
story.
We haven't identified specifically those brands, but, yeah, those possibly that.
I'm
type
sure
of thing.
they're on someone's radar,
right,
to recruit into the botnet.
Yeah, they're on the radar. And most of these others are related to, well, we have port 445 on this list as well, but the rest, ICMP and some P2P type activity that's intermingled in there. So looking at port 23, well, relatively flat in terms of the number of sources that are doing the probing, but again, like before, the volume here is pretty big. We're up in the order of about 90,000 sources on a given hour, and then when we look at this in aggregate through the day, it's on the order of about 3 times that, about 3 to 4 times, in the order of maybe 250 to 300,000 sources that are doing that probing activity. And that's just from our purview of AT&T's view of the internet. And looking at scan sources on port 53413 UDP, again this backdoor, you can see here that there was basically a dip in that activity around February 18th, perhaps loss of the command and control for the botnet or some other strange behavior. It's not the first time we've seen that. One of the things that you can kind of gain from this is that a significant portion of the activity appears to be under a common command and control. So it's not as if there are lots of different organizations that are taking advantage of this. It appears to be a relatively small group, perhaps a handful. So that's our show for today. And we'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube as well as iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. So I'd like to thank you, John. Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
I'm Brian, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.